happens that I moderate this one too, which will have two speakers, Raul Katz, who was the previous moderator, and Joost van Dreunen, who was also instrumental in the project on American media concentration. So we welcome Joost here. And he is the author of the Netherlands chapter, and Raul is a general observer of the industrial and ICT policies around the world, in particular in the developing world. And so the question that is raised is, we'll start with Raul.
Maybe just get my slides.
Okay, so we'll start with Joost, and kind of. So Joost, who is also an expert on games, among other things, is going to talk to us about industrial policy. French government, in fact, has instituted in the game sector fairly pronounced industrial policy for the last at least 10 years or so.
It's consistent with their other entertainment subsidies and film and so on. So first off, I'll start like everybody else saying thanks. I think this is a very relevant topic to the tone of spending 7 years working for Eli and then still following the industry from this perspective. I think it's a really interesting way to look at it, right? Concentration as a topic of economic policy and so on. So for me, that is a way to kind of dissect not just the industry that we happen to be in, so for me that's games, but it also gives you a much wider array, whether that's from a financial perspective or whether that's from a content provider perspective or as a consumer, to sort of think about what it means for daily life, how we interact with media. So that's sort of the intro. I'll give you a little bit about where I come from in the world and how I would tackle this question of whether or not concentration is an effective tool. So after I graduated here from Columbia, I ended up setting up a research shop in video games. And video games, much like every other entertainment industry, was switching. Right? So there was this switch that went from, on the one hand, retail all the way slowly to digital distribution. Digital distribution in music, we've seen in a very sort of dramatic way the adoption of iTunes and other, Spotify and so on, these other different ways of interacting with music, and very sort of tangible. Coming to New York 10, 15 years ago, you see the Virgin Megastore in Union Square closing down, and it's a very real thing. All of a sudden, this giant music store, and as a European, so I'm originally Dutch, CDs cost a fortune back in the day. When I was 16, I would spend 45 guilders, which is the equivalent of, I guess, $700, counting backwards. But so the idea is that, coming to the US, CDs are so much cheaper. So I would go to the Virgin Megastore and all of a sudden it was gone, this giant, behemoth of a store. And so from that sort of experience, it occurred to me that games would go the same way. So long story short, I spend my day talking to Wall Street. I talk to hedge funds. I talk to publishers that make games, that spend hundreds of millions of dollars investing in the marketing and the production of the games. And they all, 5 years ago, had the same sort of answer, saying, well, games are dying. The games industry is on decline, and in fact it was. But it was only the case at retail, because over the last 10 years, in fact, the games industry has tripled in size worldwide. But what has been declining is the physical distribution of that, right? So the retail stores, so GameStop in the US, then there's in the UK you have Game, you have a bunch of different media stores in Germany, MediaMarkt is one that comes to mind. They're all seeing declining revenues, and as a result, people go and they throw their hands in the air to say, well, it's over, it's done. So the answer then seems to be for a lot of companies to say, well, so digital, that's where it's at. The technology is going to provide an answer to all of this. And so in the question, in formulating a question to an answer to the question whether or not it's an effective tool, I'm often sort of dumbfounded how obvious it seems to do, to put our money on digital or our money on the internet, right? So the internet will save everything. I don't believe that. And so, and the reason is, very simply put, because it's a scalable business, because, so many companies have this sort of venture-backed motivation behind them. Very often it's all about capturing market share, right? Facebook, in my mind, is not necessarily the most democratic form of media or communication available, yet here we are with billions of people
using it on a daily basis. So I don't believe necessarily that technology is going to save this problem. And so then, looping it back, concentration may actually provide us with some degree of direction on it. Now, the part where concentration is not very effective as a tool, and I'll give you a yes and no sort of answer to this, is purely because as a Dutchman, I come out of this country that is so tiny and culturally perhaps a little less meaningless, but still pretty meaningless worldwide. And so when this publicly controlled, this publicly held media system, all of a sudden started to commercialize over the years, growing up. The one thing that they didn't want was certain types of content. There was not supposed to be any nudity on television. There was supposed to be, sort of government-approved type of television content. And lo and behold, RTL sets up shop in Luxembourg and starts broadcasting from some mountain straight into the Netherlands. And there was nothing that they could do about it. And so geography is a very different principle in the Netherlands than it is, for instance, in the US. Covering the US geographically alone for all these different media industries, in my mind, is a very different proposition. I remember when we talked about telecom in France, that a lot of the wires for the telecom industry are just laid in the river. They just throw it because it's too expensive to dig the holes in the ground to put all the wiring in. So in that same way, I think concentration in and of itself is a good way of looking at the industry, but it also has to do within the context of just basic parameters like geography and so on, and proximity. And then, I think finally, as a third sort of way of looking at things, right? So if I've mentioned the internet's not going to save us necessarily, and then there is sort of geography and proximity, then I would finally, of course, argue that economic fluctuations have been, felt throughout the, the world economy. The financial crisis particularly hit, of course, the Dutch media system for a variety of different reasons, and the result was that they all started to consolidate. Often from a commercial or for-profit motive, it makes much more sense to sort of put everything together and sort of regroup a little bit for a period of time so that you can withstand and maintain your business over a course of time. And in that, of course, you're acting perhaps directly opposite of some kind of notion of a democratic debate. But it's unfair to just say, oh, look, concentration here is happening and that therefore it's bad. It might just be the way that these businesses stay afloat. And so I guess what that really means then, if we talk about geography, we also have to have a timeline. And this is one of the reasons I enjoyed working with Eli on this. Having a decade, 2-3 decade long perspective is really what you need, right? Economic change doesn't occur over a period of 4 years in this kind of relevant. So those are sort of three considerations I would have in looking at this question of whether or not concentration is an effective tool. I'm very curious to hear what Raul has to say about this.
Thanks. I'll try to find a way of getting my slides in and try to go as fast as I can. If I actually can manage this.
Meanwhile, are there any comments and questions for Joost?
It was a small one, but I didn't know if I heard, I don't know if I heard it right. Were you saying in France they just lay the cables down the river?
That's what I was told. That
Okay.
I wasn't part of it, obviously, but it was essentially more expensive to dig the holes in the ground.
Sure, makes sense. Just thanks.
Just a quick question about from your vantage point. Is it increasingly changing toward mobile and haptic, or you're active participant in the gaming space for the user, and is that going to change the way the industry starts to develop production for content?
Absolutely. So mobile has essentially added $20 billion to a $60 billion industry, something along those lines. So a third of the market is now mobile games. If you go to markets like China, a lot of that is owned by a single company called Tencent. And so you have these sort of nationwide, publishing houses that just own and control everything. The top, it's a hit-driven market, so the top 10 publishers, they make most of the money in industries and so on. So yes, absolutely, this shift to a mobile platform away from console and PC has definitely changed the level of power in the industry.
Plus the games themselves are becoming so much more complex that the development costs have spiraled up to levels of a Hollywood movie, right?
It's exactly right, as Ali said. So the big change in the last 5 years in the traditional games industry has been that The top tier game companies spend double the amount, $500 million for like the highest level of production. Half of that is marketing, but still, $250 million in production. And then the second tier companies have all disappeared. So Atari, THQ, those have all been sold for parts at this point because they can't sustain that kind of capital. So that's changed a lot.
Quick comment, yes.
I don't know if in your research you ever look at the link between the games industry and violence, especially in this country. Do you have anything to say about that?
Sorry, but the topic is not games. The topic is industrial policy, and media concentration. So if you have a comment on that. Raul.
So I link back to what Ming said about the issue of efficiencies and what Joost said about the issue of sort of the goodness of concentration. And I would approach it from a pricing standpoint. And what I'm going to show you is some work that I've been doing this year. I apologize, I'm coming here completely orthogonal relative to the work that you guys have been doing. This is Latin America. This is pay TV, so it includes the satellite and the cable TV industry. And these are prices. Don't worry about all the numbers, just the last two columns says, this is pricing of the basic package of pay TV, and the last column is the position. Who's the cheapest country in Latin America? So Mexico is the cheapest country at $11, adjusted for purchasing parity, converted to US dollars and the like. So the first thing is, remember this. This is a ranking of pricing of a basic package, which is relatively homogeneous product. Everything that the channels that we see, plus a bunch of local channels. Then you look at industry concentration, and don't focus on all the numbers, just focus on the HHI, and you see the relative HHIs for industries in every single country in Latin America. Now, the issue is how do you treat DTH and cable when you have a cross ownership, and that's pretty critical. We can talk about that later, which is why maybe some people would quibble with Mexico having an HHI of 2,600 while Televisa owns a position on both sides, but we can argue about that. Even if I were to consider that as being a single property, the number would go higher and would even emphasize my conclusion. So then I say, well, is there any relationship between concentration and pricing? Can we say that the lowest the concentration, more competition, lower prices? And it's actually the other way around. I mean, in fact, there's no concentration at all. No, there's no relationship at all if you actually take a look at these correlations. And we run these correlations whichever way you want it to do. With the most economic, the dominant player, sort of an average, an arithmetic average, a prorated average. There's no relationship between concentration and pricing. So what's happening here? So we then started looking at other parameters, and we said, well, let's include two terms. One is the adoption, and the other one is the population. And then is when we start seeing some things that are kind of interesting, that adoption has a positive sign and is statistically significant, meaning that the higher adoption of cable and the higher the prices. If I take adoption, I say, well, adoption is an indication of affordability, and therefore people can pay more. I raise the prices. And then population is negative. So the higher the population, the lower the prices. So I think that what this says is, in fact, that market structure has a marginal impact on pricing. That what really has an impact is particularly adoption, but more importantly population, which relates back to the economies of scale. Mm-hmm. When you have larger economies of scale, both on programming and infrastructure, then providers can drop the prices, which explains the reason why Mexico, that is so concentrated, has the lowest pricing in the overall territory, which I think links very well to the Chinese argument. Says, I'm going to exploit economies of scale. That would enable me to lower the pricing. Clearly, that puts me in a conflict with the pluralistic argument. But nevertheless, it's just a matter of dealing with the trade-offs. That's it.
All right. Very good. Yes. All right. Okay, efficiency versus pluralism, and there we have it. We are running considerably behind. Comments are welcome, but brief.
Really.
Yes.
Now, common question. You talk about the market structure and population size that has marginal impact on the price, right?
Population has strong and
Yeah.
statistically
So
significant.
the question is, the demography, yesterday we were talking about the generation Y and Z, extremely important for the pluralism of the media and content in Africa and developing nations. From that perspective, did you have any findings about the generation Y and Z, or just in terms of demography, did you classify the percentage of youth? For example, in Turkey, 70% of the population is below 30 years old. Thank you.
Totally, and in fact, I'm completely aligned with the African experience. The barriers to entry
Same thing in Iran, same thing in Middle East.
the barriers to
countries
entry
like Africa.
in sort of internet-based media are so low on video streaming today that Netflix, that we think that is a dominant world player, is actually absolutely marginal relative to all the local activities that are occurring, coming from established players or from startups. So you got strong scale and effect on pay TV, but very low barriers to entry on the local because of the indirect network effects that occur with local content. And that's what's driving the entry of local
So the
players.
more population size, bigger the population size, the younger that population is.
I think what we're observing here, as far as I can tell, are the efficiencies on the platform side, on the distribution side, and that conforms, that's true not only for Latin America, but I think we observe it around the world, which is why these are very heavily concentrated, and you're kind of making a nice point that even more heavily concentrated seems to lower the price. It does not quite deal with the content that is provided already. I would, do you have another comment?
No.
All right. I would then, with your kind permission, and those of, since we do run behind, declare the session over, and the coffee break is 5 minutes or so delayed. So if we can squeeze that coffee break also a little bit and reconvene at 11:35, we will have caught up.